Ethiopia is aspired to be the beacon of African prosperity by 2030. To realize this ambitious plan, the Ministry of Plan and Development of Ethiopia has set up a 10-year economic prospective plan. The incumbent administration of Ethiopia chose inward, looking through introducing a homegrown economic strategy to boost the economy of the country. This strategy dictates that the country should rely on its own blessings than relying on foreign aid and donation.
Beyond importing wheat and even beyond farming for food self-sufficiency, many within us, our people and others had doubted the possibility of us working to export our produce, which was against all odds. In this summer season alone, they have farmed 250,000 hectares of wheat.
They offered $500 million in wheat, and Ethiopia still said no, not to a small company, not to a local trader, but to the United States of America. In a world where many nations beg for food aid, Ethiopia made a decision that shocked global observers, rejecting a massive U.S. wheat import deal and choosing something far more risky: its own farmers. Tonight we're uncovering the hidden story behind this bold move. Why would a developing nation turn down $500 million in guaranteed food supplies? Was this a dangerous gamble? Or the start of an economic revolution? What pressure came from foreign powers after the rejection? And could this decision change Africa's entire food future? Because what looks like just another trade dispute is actually a fight over sovereignty, survival, and self-reliance. And by the end of this video, you may never look at global food trade the same way again. They didn't announce the decision with dramatic speeches or flashing headlines. There was no press conference filled with grand statements. There was just one official move that quietly sent shockwaves through global food markets. Ethiopia declined a $500 million U.S. wheat import arrangement and chose to stand behind its own farmers instead. For decades, this kind of decision would have been unthinkable. Ethiopia has long been viewed by the world as one of Africa's most food-vulnerable nations, a country often associated with drought, emergency food aid, and reliance on imported cereals to stabilize prices in tough seasons. For years, ships from the United States and Europe delivered wheat through international aid programs and commercial contracts alike. Imported grain became not just a safety net, but a routine part of everyday food supply. So when word spread that Ethiopia was stepping away from a massive U.S. wheat import deal worth $500 million, many observers assumed something must be wrong. Analysts rushed to fill the gaps. Was Ethiopia running out of foreign currency? Was the government cutting costs? Were sanctions or diplomatic tensions involved? But none of that told the real story. The truth was more radical than anyone expected. Ethiopia had decided that dependency itself was the problem. Over the past several years, something remarkable had been happening quietly across Ethiopia's highlands and plains, a nationwide agricultural transformation few outside the region bothered to notice. The government launched large-scale programs aimed at turning millions of smallholder farmers into productive, market-oriented producers. Improved seed distribution networks expanded rapidly. Cooperative farming models were strengthened. Mechanized harvesters were introduced into areas that once relied only on hand sickles and oxen plows. In regions that had never seen modern irrigation systems, new canals and pump-based projects began carving lifelines across dry terrain. Agricultural extension workers traveled village to village teaching soil nutrition methods, pest management techniques, and water-efficient planting strategies. Local wheat varieties were upgraded, with disease-resistant strains leading to unexpectedly high yields. Within a few seasons, Ethiopia's domestic wheat production surged beyond previous estimates. The country that once depended on imports to cover food gaps began producing enough wheat to feed millions entirely from its own soil. This wasn't just a technical achievement, it was psychological, because every bag of imported wheat arriving at an Ethiopian port did more than feed consumers, it quietly crushed local market prices. Ethiopian farmers would harvest their crops only to find imported grain undercutting them at the marketplace. They couldn't compete with subsidized foreign agriculture or large-scale international shipping efficiencies. Some farmers withdrew from wheat production entirely, switching crops or abandoning farming altogether. The dependency cycle repeated. Local farmers produced less, imports replaced the shortfall, local agricultural investment declined further. Breaking that loop required something bold. Rejecting imports wasn't a symbolic protest, it was a survival strategy. But the decision came with enormous risk. Imported wheat offered consistency. It reduced inflation shocks, stabilized food supply during drought years, and protected urban consumers from price spikes. Walking away from a deal worth $500 million meant assuming full responsibility for keeping Ethiopia's bread market stable without the safety cushion of foreign grain. Reserves and leadership knew it. There were tense internal debates. Economists warned of potential shortages if weather turned unfavorable. Political advisors feared urban unrest if bread prices rose too fast. Foreign diplomats quietly expressed concern over trade disruptions and supply reliability issues. Yet leadership made a choice that prioritized long-term sovereignty over short-term comfort. Behind the scenes, the shift also symbolized wider geopolitical realignment. American wheat exports to African markets had long served dual purposes: profitable trade combined with diplomatic leverage. Food security ties often turned into political partnerships, humanitarian narratives, and influence channels over foreign policy cooperation. By stepping away from U.S. wheat, Ethiopia wasn't merely reshaping food logistics, it was signaling independence from historically unequal trading patterns, and this wasn't isolated. Across Africa, similar conversations were unfolding. In Nigeria, local rice production faced similar suppression from imported Asian rice flooding markets. In Kenya, sugar growers struggled against cheap Brazilian imports. In Senegal, poultry farmers lost profits to frozen European chicken shipments. The story everywhere was the same. Low-cost foreign imports undercut domestic production and local farmers paid the price. Ethiopia's decision quietly asked a radical question many governments avoided. What if protecting farmers is more important than protecting cheap consumer prices? For Ethiopian rural communities, the immediate effects were dramatic. As imports slowed, market prices for locally grown wheat climbed, not drastically, but enough to finally make farming profitable. Families that had struggled for years saw clear incentives to expand operations. Fields once dormant returned to cultivation. Young people who had abandoned agricultural life for cities began reconsidering farming as viable work. Cooperatives grew stronger, accessing better storage and transportation systems. Local milling facilities reopened that once shut down due to oversupply of foreign grain. Transport chains, linking rural regions to urban bread markets, expanded rapidly. Wheat became more than a crop, it became a symbol. For the first time, Ethiopian farmers felt prioritized over foreign suppliers. Urban consumers worried at first. Could domestic production meet demand? Would bread become expensive? Would shortages happen? But logistics quickly improved. Instead of relying on ships traveling thousands of miles across oceans, supply chains became internal. Grain moved directly from farms to cities faster and cheaper, reducing vulnerability to international shipping disruptions, climate effects overseas, or diplomatic conflicts. During global food market volatility, including shipping bottlenecks and international price spikes, Ethiopia stood relatively insulated. Food nationalism, long dismissed by global trade elites as inefficient or protectionist, suddenly appeared less reckless and more resilient. The $500 million U.S. deal rejection became a turning point others started studying closely. Economists began referring to Ethiopia's policy shift as a test case for post-aid self-sufficiency economics, the belief that agricultural independence offers greater long-term stability than cheap global sourcing. But not everyone applauded. Foreign agribusiness exporters criticized the move as protectionist and unfair. Some analysts argued Ethiopia was politicizing markets and risking food insecurity for nationalist ideals. Media outlets framed the story as an irresponsible gamble by an inexperienced government. But Ethiopians saw something else. They saw dignity. They saw their farmers no longer treated as backup producers beneath imported surplus dumping from wealthy countries. They saw a chance to control their own food destiny. Critics warned of drought. Local production fails during poor rainfall years, they said. Imports provide essential buffers. But Ethiopia responded with strategic reserves, building up wheat storage systems to hold surplus production during peak harvests to guard against seasonal volatility. Irrigation and greenhouse wheat programs expanded into marginal regions less dependent on rainfall cycles. Instead of imported wheat acting as the buffer, domestic stockpiles filled that role, and then something unexpected happened. Domestic production didn't just stabilize, it expanded further. With profits returning to farming communities, reinvestment accelerated naturally. Farmers purchased better equipment, irrigation pumps, fertilizer supplies, and post-harvest facilities. Cooperatives negotiated stronger regional government contracts to supply school meal programs, hospitals, and the military. Instead of foreign aid shipments feeding public institutions, local producers secured guaranteed markets, stabilizing prices for both farmers and consumers. Such contracts ensured constant demand and eliminated market volatility. Slowly, Ethiopia shifted from a wheat deficit country to one approaching full wheat supply independence. This transformation carried cultural effects too. In rural communities, farming regained social prestige. Elders witnessed new respect return to agriculture. Students in agricultural schools felt excitement rather than compromise studying land sciences. The psychology changed. Farmers no longer felt invisible. They became national heroes, quietly responsible for keeping cities fed. For American exporters, however, the impact was abrupt. Africa had been a growth market for U.S. grain shipments as Asian agricultural dependence leveled off and European markets tightened. Ethiopia turning away from large import contracts eliminated not just one client but a symbolic foothold. Other governments were watching closely. Would Ethiopia's model hold? Could nations with even larger populations replicate domestic supply strategies? Would food sovereignty sweep across Africa? Trade agencies in Washington began reassessing African export projections. Agribusiness groups proposed price discounts to retain partnerships. Humanitarian partnerships tried recasting imports as emergencies-only support programs rather than commercial markets. But when Ethiopian leadership reaffirmed its commitment publicly, they didn't just say they were protecting farmers. They said something far more powerful: we will never again feed our people by starving our own producers. That line echoed across farming communities continent-wide when economic analysts reviewed the numbers months later. Something striking emerged. Yes, initial bread prices had risen slightly during the transition, but farmer incomes tripled in many regions, rural poverty levels dropped, food availability remained stable, government grain reserve levels increased, import expenses declined dramatically, conserving foreign currency desperately needed for infrastructure, education, and healthcare development. The feared collapse never happened. Instead, the agricultural sector strengthened. Ethiopia's decision became evidence that developing nations were capable of rejecting dependency pathways carved during colonial trade periods that favored raw exports and finished food imports. This wasn't isolationism, it was recalibration. Global trade had become distorted by subsidy systems benefiting wealthy agricultural producers while disadvantaging poorer farmers in developing economies. Wheat production subsidies in North America and Europe allow export prices that African smallholders cannot compete with fairly. Rejecting those imports effectively acted as a corrective mechanism, restoring price balance at home. And perhaps most importantly, it restored confidence. When farmers believe their governments stand behind them, productivity surges faster than any foreign aid injection ever could. Ethiopia's story wasn't about rejecting the U.S. It was about rejecting dependence, and that distinction matters deeply. The country did not end international trade. It simply declared that trade must no longer undermine domestic survival systems. Wheat imports might resume in emergency conditions, but they would no longer drown local farmers during successful harvest years. This policy balance offered a new blueprint for Africa. Import supplements only when domestic supply falls short, never as default replacement. It may seem simple, but this philosophy reverses decades of post-colonial economic programming that taught nations to rely on imports rather than strengthen domestic productivity. And now the ripple effects have begun. Several African agriculture ministers have publicly cited Ethiopia's example. Policy memos circulate proposing domestic grain protection models. Regional farmers' unions echo Ethiopia's strategy as a symbol for economic sovereignty campaigns. Everywhere, the central question grows louder: why should African farmers starve while foreign farmers profit from African markets? The moral contradiction has become impossible to ignore. For consumers watching from around the world, this story forces a deeper rethink. Cheap imported food may feel beneficial at checkout counters, but beneath those low prices often stand weakened local farming sectors, job losses, rural decline, and permanent dependency cycles. Ethiopia's gamble showed something radical. Economic independence costs more at first but pays for generations. And now, as Ethiopia continues expanding irrigation corridors, modernizing storage infrastructure, and supporting mechanized cultivation, wheat output projections climb higher each season. This once aid-dependent nation quietly approaches what few imagined possible: feeding itself first. The $500 million offer became not a temptation, but a test of whether Ethiopia believed in its farmers enough to withstand pressure, and it passed. Because the true wealth of a nation isn't the money it accepts, it's the people it chooses to empower. And Ethiopia chose its farmers. As we come to the end of this powerful story, it's important to pause, breathe, and understand the true weight of what South Africa has just done. This moment isn't only about banking, technology, or financial systems. It's about something far deeper, something nations fight for, people dream of, and history remembers. It's about ownership, dignity, and the courage to stand tall in a world built to keep you small. South Africa's decision to reject U.S. banking influence and build its own payment system is more than a headline. It's a reminder that a nation can reclaim its voice, even when the world expects silence. It shows that a country can write its own economic story, even when others have held the pen for decades. And it proves that true strength is not measured by wealth or the size of your military, but by the boldness of your decisions. For years, African financial systems have been shaped from the outside. Western-controlled networks, Western guidelines, Western approvals, all influencing how money moves, how banks operate, and how economies breathe. But today, South Africa said something the world was not prepared to hear. We will no longer depend on a system that was never built for us. And when a nation discovers its courage, the world shakes. This outro is not just for South Africa, but for everyone who has ever been underestimated, controlled, or overlooked. Because what South Africa just did is a symbol of possibility. A symbol that no matter how long outside powers have held influence, a country can rise, reset the rules, and reclaim the power that always belonged to it. Think about the farmers in rural provinces, the small businesses in crowded city streets, the young tech entrepreneurs building apps in back rooms, the mothers trying to support their families, the workers trying to put food on their tables. For them, a local payment system is not a political statement, it's hope. Hope that money will move faster. Hope that fees will be lower. Hope that local banks will become stronger. Hope that their country will no longer depend on decisions made thousands of miles away. Hope that the future belongs to them. And yes, Washington may panic. Financial analysts may worry. Global institutions make all this risky, radical, or unpredictable. But those same words were used to describe every revolution in history, the kinds of revolutions that changed nations forever. South Africa's move is telling Africa and the world that sovereignty is not something you ask permission for. It is something you seize. And now other countries are watching. Kenya is watching. Nigeria is watching. Ghana is watching. Tanzania, Rwanda, Egypt all watching to see if South Africa's bold first step will open the door for something bigger than itself. Because once one country breaks the chain, others begin to feel their strength, and maybe that is what worries world powers the most, that Africa may finally realize the scale of its influence and the value of its resources, that the continent may finally choose unity over dependency, ownership over obligation, independence over approval. As we close, remember this. History does not reward the silent, it rewards the bold, and today South Africa has written its name boldly across the front page of global economic history. Whether this move changes the continent's financial future forever, only time will tell. But one thing is certain, a door has been opened, a message has been sent, and the world will never look at South Africa or Africa the same way again. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, make sure you stay with us, because what's coming next will shake the global economy even more. Africa is rising, and this is just the beginning.